Let's talk about what we just heard. Bret Stephens, obviously, you have a balancing act for an awful lot of people that work for this White House who actually feel like sometimes they feel like they need to leave. Other times they feel like they need to stay there and keep doing the sort of thing that Dan Coats did yesterday and has been doing through the week. What's your take on the balancing act that they're making and when they should finally just throw in the towel?
Yeah, I think with a lot of these guys, they tell themselves privately that they're cleaning up for the president, but more recently, I think they're covering up for the president. I think that goes particularly for John Bolton and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Now, I've known both men for years, as I'm sure you have, and if they've had one consistent view or two consistent views is, first of all, don't negotiate with dictators in North Korea. They never keep their word. It's a fool's gambit. The United States should never do that. And secondly, don't trust the Russians, especially former KGB agents like Vladimir Putin. Now, here you have both men going along with probably the most accommodationist or appeasement-oriented policy that an American president has had, and as long as you or I can remember. I mean, this puts the Russian reset to shame in terms of the way in which President Trump has consistently reached out to Putin, has apologized for him, has taken his side in disputes. And at some point, you have to ask yourself, or you have to ask John and Mike, how long can you go along with this policy and honor your conscience to say nothing of your country? I just don't see how they can do it except unless they're so addicted to the aphrodisiac of power that they're going to run with it for as long as they stay in office.
Well, Tim Carney, you and I and a lot of our friends have grown up listening to John Bolton especially. And while I wasn't thrilled about John Bolton going to work for the White House because I didn't know that he could play well with others, the two things that gave me solace was the fact that nobody in Washington, D.C. Has been tougher on Russia and Iran, and specifically Vladimir Putin, than John Bolton. You can do a quick Google search on Bolton and Russia and come up with just potpourri of tough, no compromise comments about how Vladimir Putin is a corrupt ex-KGB agent who wants to take over Western Europe.
Well, I think there's two interesting divides going on here. In fact, right at this table with me and Bret, sort of that highlights a divide on the right. One, what you have with Bolton and Pompeo, and why I think you're reaching out to them, Bret, is that they are very hawkish Republicans who are more likely to want to push things up to the point of conflict, whether it's up to the point of war in Syria, that sort of thing. But the other is just the attitude towards Trump. I think a lot of us, Bret and I were both, you could have called us never Trump conservatives during the election. But after the election, I don't think that phrase means anything. So the idea that, oh, they're still supporting Trump, they're still working for Trump. For me, the question is, on what given policy? So are they helping Trump appease Putin, or are they trying to push Trump in the right direction on Putin? So I don't think it makes sense to say, oh, well, you're still on Trump's side, he's doing these bad things, you need to quit. I think the job of everybody, whether it's somebody in the administration like Pompeo or Bolton, or whether it's conservative commentators like us, is to push Trump in the right direction. He's not on the ballot right now. To oppose Trump is a meaningless idea when he's not on the ballot.
But I'll even put something even a little more out there, and it's a little in the weeds, but you also don't have government functioning at full capacity. So if you have a Pompeo resign, what happens to the people at Secretary of State? Right now, the three top cyber people, including an assistant director at the FBI, are leaving. That means those are vacancies in cyber as we're going into the 2018 midterm election. So resigning is a great concept, but we need our government to be working as well.
Well, and there's so many situations. John Heilemann, for instance, if for some reason Dan Coats was pushed out, was fired, or resigned under pressure, it's just like Jeff Sessions. Good luck having the United States Senate allow Donald Trump to replace him with anybody else. That's why the firing of Dan Coats under these circumstances is just not possible. Let's get back, though, to John Bolton, though, who actually 1 year ago today, Nikki Egan points out to Alex and the rest of us, 1 year ago today, Vladimir Putin, this is a John Bolton op-ed, and his headline is, Vladimir Putin looked Donald Trump in the eye and lied to him. We negotiate with Russia at our own peril. Where are those conservative Cold War hawks these days? Oh, wait, he's locked outside the door when Donald Trump is talking to his chief, Vladimir Putin.
Well, right, Joe. I think it's obviously it's a stunning thing that's happened with John Bolton, and I want to take it back to Brett and to Tim, just because I think you're pointing to a very interesting divide among what used to be called Never Trump Republicans. Tim, isn't it part of the flaw in your argument potentially that there doesn't seem to be any real effect? You know, if John Bolton's there to try to moderate Trump's tendencies towards Putin, doesn't this last week make you look up and say, on how am I affecting this policy in a positive way? And isn't it better for the country if, as I think what Brett, again, I'll let you speak for yourself, but I think for Republicans and former Never Trump Republicans or current Never Trump Republicans, or your mindset is the country's in crisis. Well, the government's not functioning. Something's going on here that's deeply disturbing between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. And it would be the argument for Mike Pompeo or Dan Coats to quit would be, this is the moment where we need to stand together and act in unison to signal to the country that we are in a crisis moment now, and we no longer have the ability to moderate Donald Trump's tendencies because he is giving away the store to Putin for reasons we don't understand.
You can't change the way Donald Trump as a person behaves. He is, this very big child who is not containable. But the administration can be moved. So if you look at how the administration has been vis-a-vis Russia, it hasn't been obedient towards Russia. It's Trump the man, and in the room with Putin the man. That's the problem.
Look, but, they used to say about Reagan, let Reagan be Reagan, and I'm tempted to say let Trump be Trump. The president we elected Donald Trump as president, or a portion of America did. He is the president. He deserves to have cabinet officers who are going to follow out his policies and his instincts. And there are plenty of people there. I can imagine Secretary of State Tucker Carlson, National Security Advisor Seb Gorka.
I was wondering where you were going
These are
with this.
people with incredible ethical elasticity, and they reflect. And they're going to reflect the man. Right now you have people consoling themselves with a lie, which is, okay, Pompeo and Bolton, these guys are hawks, and they're going to keep the president in check. The truth is that we have an executive system of government in which the president has secretaries. We call them secretaries for a reason. They have purely administrative functions to carry out his policies. And we are deceiving ourselves if we think that putting in a John Kelly, Trump Coats is going to modulate or moderate the policy. Americans need to see just what kind of government they really have.
Well, and yet, Yamiche, if you look at the policies of this administration, if you look at what's actually been passed in Congress with the sanctions, if you look at the statements of everybody around Donald Trump, from UN Ambassador Nikki Haley to Vice President Mike Pence, when he is not lathering Donald Trump in praise. I go back to when he went to the Baltics and delivered an anti-Putin, anti-Russia speech every bit as tough as Ronald Reagan's. If you look at the people around Donald Trump, who Donald Trump has appointed, they are let's just say, harsher on Russia than George W. Bush or Barack Obama both were. The policies seem to be harsher on Russia than they were under Bush or Barack Obama. And yet, right at the center of this, you have a man tweeting and making statements that actually make him look like he's an agent of an ex-KGB officer. It is hard for our allies to sort through, but to borrow Ross Perot's phrase, if you look at where the rubber meets the road, we do have some policies on Russia that are fairly tough.
Well, when I talk to sources, they tell me that you have to make the difference between what President Trump is doing, his rhetoric, his actions, even his body language in the Helsinki press conference, which I attended, and the actual policies of the United States, which are tough on Russia. The Trump administration has expelled Russian officials. They've closed consulates. They have not let up on the Russian sanctions. So there's this idea that when I talk to people, I talked to the Douglas Lute, who was the U.S. ambassador to NATO, former ambassador to NATO. He told me, well, all that was going on, and NATO allies are going to start dealing or trying to plan workarounds for the United States because they don't trust the United States under the Trump administration. The actual nuts and bolts of what came out of it was that the United States is not changing our relationship with NATO, that we're not taking out troops of any of the NATO military operations. That said, being in that meeting, being in that press conference, it was happening in Finland, but it could have been happening in Russia. Vladimir Putin spoke first. His body language at the beginning of the day was kind of slumped in his chair. But by the time that press conference came around, he was standing up, he was smirking, he was smiling. He felt like he was the host. And you could tell that he was having a good time here. And I think that's what's worrying a lot of people. And of course, there's that 90-minute meeting that turned into a 2-hour one-on-one session where intelligence communities are still trying to figure out what was said. And that's what's really scary about this. The people who work for President Trump still don't know what he gave away to Vladimir Putin.
And Katty Kay, these are such bizarre times, Katty, where you have Donald Trump bowing and scraping to an ex-KGB agent who maintains power through assassination and tries to undermine American democracy and Western democracies. But again, you look at the administration's positions against Russia, and I'm torn. I mean, first of all, because Donald Trump is so obsequious toward Vladimir Putin, you know that we have to have the toughest policies, the toughest sanctions possible against Vladimir Putin. At the same time, when you take a step back, you go, well, wait, at some point we need to start actually building a positive relationship with the Russians. But it seems that Donald Trump's bowing and scraping actually gets in the way of us being able to have any constructive talks with the Russians.
Yeah, and this is the confusion surrounding U.S.-Russian relationships at the moment. I spoke yesterday to Bill Browder. He was the American-born financier who was also on that list of people that President Putin wants to have interrogated by the Russian officials. He was the guy that led to the passing of the Magnitsky Act. And he was horrified at the idea that Donald Trump's gut in that meeting is to say that this is an incredible offer. This is where Donald Trump seems to want to come from, to pacify Vladimir Putin, to agree with Vladimir Putin, to give in to Vladimir Putin on something so substantial as handing over Americans and American-born people to be interrogated by Russian officials. And yet even Bill Browder said, yeah, but when it comes to policies, America is very tough at the moment on Russia, and the Trump administration has actually been tougher on Russia than the Obama administration was. So, this is where the confusion is. If the Trump administration is going to be so tough with these sanctions, with the closing of consulates, with hitting people who are close to Putin, some of the oligarchs who are close to Putin personally, then why is it so hard for Donald Trump to then also say, as Dan Coates did and as Chris Wray did, Vladimir Putin was responsible for meddling in the U.S. elections. Nothing happens in Russia without Vladimir Putin's say-so, and it must never happen again. Russia is the aggressor here. We heard it from members of his government over the course of the last 24 hours, and yet he just can't say it. It's almost like it's a personal thing with Putin rather than a policy issue with Russia itself.
Well, and Donnie, that's what is, I mean, this is what this past week has shown. We need to separate the personal from the policy. And I know Donald Trump thinks the personal is the policy, but it's not. And let's think about, again, just digging into this much more. We have a president who does look like he is owned by Vladimir Putin. Looks that way. I don't think it is hard for anyone to deny that it doesn't look like he's afraid of Vladimir Putin, and Vladimir Putin has something on him.
Joe, he does.
That said,
I'm sorry.
but okay, he does. All right, okay. You and I know Trump We both believe that he does. In fact, I would
Bet everything.
bet an awful lot, bet a lot on that. Okay, so we have that fact, all right? Now let's go to the next step. But he has appointed people that actually are tough on Russia. He's appointed John Bolton, who even a year ago was calling Putin a liar that you couldn't trust and that you couldn't negotiate with. Mike Pompeo, who's always been a conservative's conservative on Iran and Russia. Dan Coates, I mean, that guy, a rock-ribbed conservative from Indiana, a senator, he's throwing fastballs at Putin's head. Christopher Wray, no fear. I mean, Christopher Wray says what he believes, goes after it, says the Russians are meddling. Secretary Mattis, when Donald Trump was attacking NATO, Secretary Mattis, what did he say? He said NATO is so important that if it didn't exist, we would have had to invent it. What do these 5 people have in common? They have many things in common, but one thing they have in common is Donald Trump appointed all of them. And they're all tough on Russia, and they're all speaking out when Donald Trump's being obsequious. So this isn't as simple. I mean, as Bret Stephens said, he could be appointing people who are craven cowards, who aren't conservatives, who will do whatever Donald Trump tells him to do. Sean Hannity could be Secretary of State. I mean, and you could go down the list. There are a lot of craven people who are trying to undermine Bob Mueller's investigation. He could appoint them as Attorney General. It's almost like he knows that he can't. But it is not a tale of 2 cities. It is a tale of 2 administrations.
Yeah, I mean, what you're suggesting, and it's a fascinating point, is, okay, if we go on the premise, and there is no other explanation, we could sit with some learned folks and say, why is he so subservient? Well, obviously, he's owned, whether it's a tape, whether it's 20 years of business dealings. But then you punch a hole in that and go, well, if that's the case, to your point, why is he not surrounding himself with less hawkish people? I believe he's doing a balancing act because at the end of the day, I think on some level he knows he loses his base. He loses who he is if he goes any other way. But on a personal level, he is just afraid of stepping over that one-on-one boundary of it's me versus him, or I'm going to say this personally about him, because at the end of the day, he is owned. Our president, despite the fact, to your point, and this would put some kind of holes in that theory, does surround himself with hawkish people. There is no other explanation. And if you understand the way this man has done business, that he is owned by our #1 geopolitical enemy. I'm going to say it again. He is owned. You're shaking your head no.
Yeah,
there's no other explanation.
I don't
give me and you can't use the explanation, well, he's concerned about the validity of his election.
I'm going to give you more evidence.
As Joe pointed out, he was doing this before the election. Give me one other rational explanation.
Well, I'm going to give you, so here's the rational explanation. He likes strong men. And here, so some evidence to show why my explanation is simpler, and Occam's razor suggested over your explanation. When he's talking about Kim Jong-un, he was on Voice of America with Greta Van Susteren, and she said, "You're talking to the North Korean people here. What do you have to say about Kim Jong-un?" He said this gross praisings. Well, Kim Jong-un feels very warmly about the North Korean.
He also
people.
called a rocket man at one point.
But the gross praise for Kim Jong-un fits into the same category as the attitude towards Putin, which fits into the same category as the praise for Duterte and his attitude towards Erdogan. So all these guys, all these strongman dictators, he buddies up to them. I don't think that Erdogan and Kim have stuff on him. I think he likes strongmen.
At the end of the day, having this argument about whether he's a schmuck or a stooge leads to the same.
Can we say that, Joe?
Leads to the same conclusion. It's also possible to think that he's had a kind of ideological affinity for Russia, a psychological affinity for strongmen. At the end of the day, you have a president who is determined to buck his advisors and seek a relationship with Russia which is antithetical to the interests of the free world. And that should matter to us all. And by the way, one final important point. Yes, he surrounded himself with Russia hawks. But the mistake is to think that the hawks are influencing him. The truth is he is transforming the nature and the ideology of the Republican Party. The number of Republicans who take a dim view of Vladimir Putin is down since 2015. The number of Republicans who approve of Vladimir Putin has more than doubled. It's still just 25%, but he is winning his way towards transforming the foreign policy of the party to what it used to be in the 1930s, quasi-isolationist, America first, dismissive of the interests of the free world and of our allies, and sympathetic to autocrats. And whether the explanation is a conspiracy theory or the fact that he simply is in love with strongmen, or that he's always liked Russians, at the end of the day, that's less interesting than what the result is for U.S. foreign policy.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.